If you are in America illegally and you happen to live in Washington, D.C. for at least 30 days, you can now vote in their elections. You heard me right. You can now participate in their democratic processes. Just saying that phrase, democratic processes, and then juxtaposing it against this makes me want to throw up. In all honesty, it's such a contradiction of terms. It's such an oxymoron. And I have no clue why this story is not being talked about by more people. So as I mentioned a few moments ago, my friends, Washington, D.C. recently, as of the posting of this video, decided it'd be a good idea to greenlight not only people who are here illegally being able to vote in their elections, but also foreign diplomats, people who are not even full citizens of America, who come from a different political dimension in America. They've also greenlit them being able to vote in Washington, D.C.'s elections. Now, we have to understand something. The justification for this is almost as specious and insulting as the fact that this exists in the first place. The council member who introduced this measure in D.C., Charles Allen, had the following quote to say to justify this proposition. He said, "This bill is in line with our D.C. values and this council's history of expanding the right to vote." We'll talk about that in a moment. "And welcoming new voices into our political process and government." He then went on to say, "Our immigrant neighbors of all statuses participate, contribute, and care about our community and in our city." So there are a few justifications tied into this statement for this rather bizarre measure. First of all, we should understand that nations are meant to be governed by principles. Unfortunately, nations and localities and municipalities are oftentimes governed by moneyed interest. They're oftentimes governed by perverse interests. They're oftentimes governed by the wills of those who have been influential in those communities for a very long time, as opposed to being governed by sound principles. This is why you see so much corruption in the political system. This is why there's such a cultural disdain for politicians, because this is a sort of a common sense understanding of what politics is. It's the process of governance that oftentimes turns into this race for ultimate power, which corrupts the soul, hardens the heart, and then puts everyone who's in proximity to it in this bizarre downward spiral towards despair. This is why all the doomsayers on YouTube and TikTok and Twitter are so popular. This is why some of them can scream civil war and people will get up and say yes. This is why some of them can scream national divorce and people will get up and say yes, this is good, because people have lost any sense of hope in the current political system because of the fact that principles have been rejected by the people in power. It is a manufactured crisis. So when a nation rejects principles, it loses all basis upon which to govern, and its governance becomes one of whim and not one of calculation. Imagine driving a car and not being able to push the brakes, not knowing where you're going, not having any street lights or signs to guide your driving, and just driving like you will. You'd kill people. A nation is acting like that hapless driver, or at least DC is acting like that hapless driver, unfortunately. The first and foremost principle of any nation has to be a basic respect for its citizenry. And allowing people who are not even of your nation, whether it be legally or otherwise, to participate in the nation's processes is a blatant disrespect to your citizenry. Now, the justifications are interesting because in one sense, Mr. Allen said that our immigrant neighbors of all statuses participate, contribute, and care about our community and our city. But being a citizen is not about being a good communitarian. Being a citizen has a different prerequisite to that. But let's talk more about being an American. Because American citizenship, unfortunately, has been seen as this cheap commodity to coax and to covet through green card systems and all these other bizarre ways we understand American citizenship. That's all secondary to what it is. Being an American citizen is about being a philosophically minded individual who understands a few things. Number one, he understands that the value of the individual is insurmountable to any other political measure or any other value statement in society. That means that as an individual, you are valuable, you are needed, you are necessary. for civilization to flourish. You're not the only thing that's valuable. Obviously, community matters, but the primacy of the individual is important. Number two, as an American, you recognize the importance of popular sovereignty to correcting the impulses of government structures that may go haywire. And unfortunately, those same structures have hijacked popular sovereignty, hence this, for their own purposes. As an American, you recognize the foundational nature of the world through natural law and natural rights, and you use that as a moral lens to see political and social issues. As an American, you affirm the fact that society is not a top-down measure, but a bottom-up measure, with you being the spark that makes that bottom-up measure go up. As an American, you have to affirm certain moral axioms. This is not my opinion. This is what our founders ingrained into the concept of Americanism, and this is what the American tradition has been doing for over 100 or plus, or even more than that, 200 or so years now, with, of course, enemies coming in to usurp this tradition. Being a good communitarian has nothing to do with being a good American. The fact that the idea of the community being able to govern things is a collectivist mindset as it relates to the nation. The sort of idea behind this is called the common good. And the common good basically says, and there's been many iterations of it, but the common good in our current contemporary conversation basically says this: political action should be taken that are measured for the good of the whole, as opposed to the good of individuals, as opposed to even maybe the good of dominant principles that may go against the good of the whole. This is a core principle of progressivism. This is a core principle of so-called national conservatism, which is not conservatism. It is something different. It is a pre-Enlightenment, nightmare, dystopian nightmare. This is the organizing principle of post-liberalism. The idea that the community should usurp sound principles and stand above the individual. It is a utilitarian idea that gives power to numerical proportions as opposed to sound, rational principles. That's what's being used in this D.C. decision. And it's an idea that is very old, unfortunately. It's much older than the country, actually. And it has been stated by theorist after theorist after theorist. And it is an idea, unfortunately, that does attack the ethos of America, because America's emphasis is on the individual and on sound principles, not on numerical proportions, not on majorities being able to run roughshod over processes that are necessary for the maintenance of a nation. But then there's another concept here. Not only does ignorance of the tenets of Americanism bring about such things, it also brings about confusions about fundamental concepts. The idea of rights, and I have spoken about this time and time and time again. I wish more folks could hear it. The idea of rights has nothing to do with the government granting you anything. Rights are not debt. Rights are not lended to you by the government. Rights are integral to who you are as a human being. This goes all the way back to the beginning of the Enlightenment, with Francisco Suarez, the great Spanish scholastic, who was the first theorist, the first legal theorist to really articulate rights as we know them today. Then Grotius, who was one of his students in passing, took that idea and then interpreted it in his own way. And that idea influenced John Locke, and that idea influenced the Declaration of Independence, and that set the foundation for the American experiment. And that idea of rights comes from a little word called ius, I-U-S. And that simply means things that belong to you as a person, things that belong to your being. You don't have a right to vote because voting does not belong to you as a person. You don't come out of the womb with the ballot box. But you have a right to life, liberty, and your property. You have a right to self-ownership. You have a right to govern yourself in accordance with a manner that does not affect other people. You have the right to live, to not be interfered with in your living to a reasonable extent. These are things that cannot be given to you, but can only be attacked by an external force. Things that are already presumed and things that your humanity requires. Rights are qualities that are necessary for people to live moral and responsible lives. Remember how John Adams talked about a moral and religious people? Well, part of the morality of the founding generation was the fact that if you don't have rights, you can't exist in society. This is why people who say we need the government to do all this kind of stuff, don't you realize when the government gets involved more and more and more in the social processes, it erodes the foundation of society, which is voluntary interaction, and thus restricts liberty, and thus inhibits the human being's ability to live well. It's not some sort of libertine talking point to say the government is the most fundamental threat to human freedom and flourishing in history. And the second most fundamental threat to human freedom and flourishing in history is ignorance and contempt. And the ignorance I see displayed here, the ignorance of rights, the ignorance of Americanism, and the ignorance of proper ethics, which I've all explained throughout this video, is leading D.C. to a fundamentally irrational policy. You do not preference non-citizens over your own citizens. I don't care if they're diplomats. I don't care if they're illegal immigrants. I don't care. Because a nation has certain prerequisites it must meet lest it fall apart, lest it not function properly, lest it retrograde into the stuff of tyranny. Lest it become a nation of whim and feeling and not a nation of law, of true law, of moral law, of natural law. That's what's happening here in D.C. Some folks may just want red meat and say, oh, we can just attack the Democrats for not liking Americans. Yeah, but that's not going to do anything because the ideas that are a prerequisite for this kind of action exist on the right as well. Not in greater quantities, but they still exist. And as a constitutional conservative, it is my goal to try to fight against these ideas with reason and logic and constitutionalism. But if we just look at the team who's doing it and not the phenomenon that's occurring and the undercurrents of that phenomenon in society, this will keep happening in different forms. You cannot maintain any system with integrity by allowing those who are not of the system, or rather not of the area the system governs, and who are not here legally, to partake in that system. It's disrespectful, it lacks integrity, it's irrational, for all the reasons I explained. And there's no fundamental justification for it. Voting is a privilege, my friends, and it should be viewed that way. It's an important privilege, but it's a privilege nonetheless. And to say that it's a right is a degradation of what rights mean. And it's a suggestion that government is the one who gives you your ability to act in society. And you don't already have the ability to act in society. And it's always the opposite. The opposite case is the government always takes away or inhibits your ability to act in society. It doesn't give you crap. I'll leave it there. My friends, please think deeply about these things. Whenever you see a news story that provokes anger, think to yourself, what in this news story? What is the basis? What are the principles that undergird this? Because when you recognize principles, when you understand what's going on, then my friends, I believe you'll be able to find a rational solution to any problem. I love you guys so much. Like this video, subscribe to this channel, share this video, comment on this video. I'll see you guys later. Stay pensive. Bye.